Welcome back to the Renewed Hope After Loss. I'm your host, Kelli Sheumaker. I'm an advanced grief recovery specialist. I was trained and certified by the Grief Recovery Institute. If you are new here, this podcast is a space for real conversations about grief, healing, and hope that can be found after loss. In today's episode, I'm honored to welcome Chelsey Gordon. She's a writer, a grieving heart, and an author of Echoes of Absence, a beautifully and deeply honest poetry collection born from her own experience with loss. Chelsey's poetry resonates deeply with readers, providing a sense of connection and comfort. If you ever struggle with putting your grief into words, I believe that Chelsey's story will speak to your soul. So let's dive in. Chelsey, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you start by sharing a bit about what inspired you to write Echoes of Absence?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for having me, Kelli. I love that you've carved out this space for people who have gone through loss and just to be able to come and talk about it. That's, part of the reason that I wrote the book. So I didn't actually start writing Echoes of Absence until quite a few years had passed after some really deep losses. I had lost my dad and my sister, and about 4, 5, 6 years later, I really started diving into writing poetry. I had never written poetry before. I just knew that I needed some safe space to really kind of contemplate those feelings and go through them. So that, started the journey to Echoes of Absence.
Thank you so much for doing that. I mean, it's a beautiful, real struggle. When I read it, I was like, I remembered times where I was in the hospital room with my mom. So it was just very honest. And I love that about the book. Did that help you process any of your grief? Tell me a little bit about that.
It did, yeah. And I'm glad to hear that, that was your experience as a reader too. I don't think I was expecting the memories to come back as clearly and as vividly as they did, because, we all know that when you're going through the grieving process freshly, everything feels so new and so raw. But because it had been a little while, I thought, this will be, easy. We're just gonna, get this out. But it really did take me back. And I was, transported back to being in the hospital rooms and having those conversations with family and, seeing your loved one. Both of the experiences that I talk about in the book did take place in the hospital. So there was a lot of, seeing your family member and things like that. But it did really help me process through. And I think we all kind of do this to some extent, where and maybe not every time, but I know that I had intentionally tried to heal through the grieving process. But I think sometimes things just kind of slide off and we think that we're good. We're like, we've gotten through this. And then something comes up later, like a song or a memory or, a smell even. And you're like, whoa, I didn't think that, this would be my response. So really just diving back in and being able to bring it back to God. And really look at it from his eyes and his view on eternity really helped me process through a lot of the lingering thoughts that I still had.
Yeah, I think everybody thinks that once you finish your grief, it's gone. Mm-hmm. And, like you said, it's very honest that when you have a memory, like a sense of smell, like you smell fresh baked cookies or a song comes on the radio, sometimes the memories, it really transport you back to that time with that person. And, those are really precious memories that we have with that person. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, a lot of times, and you kind of touched on this, sometimes we think we have gone through the process and life gets busy. And often when we're grieving, there's a time period that sometimes you have to go back to work, you go back to school, you have to do your things that you're not able to fully process your grief. And so often we push it down, not realizing that we didn't finish it. There's a big myth out there that time heals all wounds. And we think that if time passes enough, it will just heal us. And unfortunately, that's not true. So, all of a sudden that grief can come back. Sometimes it's those smells and those songs can bring up good memories and that feeling that you have with that person. But sometimes if we haven't dealt with that grief, it brings up the pain. It brings up that very raw pain that we felt before. And we're like, wait, why did that come back up so quickly?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, kind of one of the biggest things about time too, is time's going to pass either way. So if we're not being intentional to go through the healing process and, process all these feelings and thoughts and new experiences we're having, because even, when we lose someone, like I was 16 when I lost my dad. So still, not an adult, not fully developed yet. But even when you're intentionally processing, things change, right? Because now it's the first time that I'm a 23-year-old who's going through, the grief process of losing her dad. So really just being open to, I think, experiencing things and really feeling our feelings and honoring our thoughts and not letting that overtake us and not kind of dwelling in it, but letting them happen so that we're not pushing them down, whether accidentally or intentionally.
I was reading your book and, because of your loss of your dad, you had the loss of not only his death, but you also had a loss in your childhood or your separation with your dad because of the divorce or the separation of your parents. And there was a big loss there. And that's often people don't realize that's a huge moment of grief in our lives. And especially children, they don't always know how to deal with that. Did you recognize that, or did you notice that came up when he died, that all that other grief of stuff that happened in your childhood of not being around him and that absence, did that come up and kind of intensify your loss, when he was in the hospital and when he died?
Yeah, it did. I mean, that's a great question because that really plays into a lot of it. And that's one of the reasons, besides just the time lapse between when it happened and when I wrote it, that's one of the reasons I chose the title. Because there was a lot of absence with my dad and my sister during childhood and everything like that. And I even had, some people ask you weren't really that close with your dad. Like, why are you, so affected by his death? Which is a crazy, thing to think that. But sometimes when, we mean well, but we don't always know how to respond to others when they're going through grief. And so those of us who have been through it kind of have some grace because we think, you're just trying to be nice. You're trying to ask questions and, engage. But yes, it did. And it also, I also think that I went through the grief of what could have been, not just what didn't happen. And we had found out some things later after he passed where I think his relationship with God was deeper than any of us really believed it to be. So at the time he died, that was, really hard to process through, not thinking that he had a relationship with God, because obviously I want that for him. And it's also very deep when death is involved because we've got the whole eternity conversation. But he also had gone through a lot before his death. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He had made a really bad mistake when he was really young. And I don't think he ever forgave himself for that. So I think that was kind of like this heavy cloud that was always over him. And even when he wanted to, do well, I just think it was really hard because he felt pushed down because of that. And so even when he was alive, I wanted him to have that relationship with Christ, to let go of that, to not feel that burden anymore and to be able to step into that relationship with Christ. So really just mourning, because I was 16, so I was getting old enough to where we could have built a relationship with me just on my own, which, didn't get to happen. So I do think it's, it's really important to acknowledge that just the loss of someone is not the only type of grief we feel, even in death. There's lots of different types of losses there. And then, we grieve things that aren't the loss of a person. There's, circumstances and family life and friendships that, still can be grieved.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And I love you started talking about it, is that loss of that expectation of a better relationship with your dad, that expectation of having that daddy-daughter relationship, having that future with him, maybe even having him walk you down the aisle, all those kinds of things that you have those hopes, dreams, and expectations for that relationship. And that's a big loss when you don't get that and you don't have that opportunity to have that.
Absolutely, yeah. And even, when you're in the middle of it, I remember we got the call, or my aunt called my mom to let her know that he was in the hospital. And by this time they had been separated and divorced for, a decade. But she called and let her know what was going on. And he, had a history of alcoholism, drug abuse. He was in and out of rehab and jail when we were growing up. So and I always say, and this is, kind of deeper, bringing in the drug abuse side of the equation, but it's less of a surprise and more of it feels like it's finally happened, the big thing that we were heading towards on this path. So we thought that we maybe weren't going to make it back home to see him because we were in Arizona and this was in Maryland. Oh. So we were like, this is it. This is going to happen. This is, real now. But even in the middle of it, I remember having those thoughts of, my dad's not going to meet, my future husband. He's not going to meet my kids. He's not going to be able to walk me down the aisle. And it's, it's crazy how our brains do that to us, where we're going through something big and our brain's just all these little and medium things that we're, shooting off in all these different directions. But yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of experiences and thoughts that we grieve as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think sometimes we get stuck in, instead of living in the present, I think grief sometimes the what ifs. What if this happened? What if this happened? And then the future, what if I did this different? What I did this different? Maybe I wouldn't be dealing with this. Or if I had a different relationship with my dad, maybe I wouldn't be feeling this way. But then also we get stuck in well, I wanted this future with him, this relationship with him that I don't have. So instead of just being in the present, sometimes we get stuck in the past and the future and not walking in that presence. And I think that's the important thing of dealing with our grief instead of just ignoring it, which unfortunately many people do, is just ignore the grief because they're just hoping that it goes away. And a lot of times too, and why I want to do this show is to kind of really talk about there are tools to help you deal with grief. And a lot of times we have not been given those tools. The tools that we've been given are sometimes what society tells us, oh, just ignore it, don't feel bad about it, anything, don't let anyone see you cry. That's a sign of weakness, right? And so instead of dealing with our grief, we got to put it away because we don't want anyone to know that I'm sad. Or I should be over it by now.
Well, and we don't want to make them uncomfortable, right? Like
right.
And it kind of starts like that. And even if, our family and loved ones don't mean it, it kind of is presented as that too. Because right when you experience the loss or, the big event, everyone's asking how you're doing. They're all there. Sometimes there's like the meal trains and things like that. But then, once you get a couple weeks into it, it's like those kind of start drifting away. And then once you get like a month into it, nobody's really asking how you're doing anymore. And so then you kind of feel like, oh, I can't talk about it because now nobody wants to talk about it anymore. Like over, like I'm supposed to be, past this, which was, I started writing the book just to kind of be able to get through my feelings. But very quickly, as I was writing it, I realized, oh, this isn't for me. Like, this is going to be for other people. Absolutely. And God may use it to help me process through some stuff. But my goal is for the book is for other people to feel a little less alone and have a space where even if they don't have someone in their life right now that they can talk about things with, they'll be able to read these pages and think, wow, at least I'm not alone. Like, at least, these are normal feelings, right? These are typical things that I'm not going through on my own.
And that's one of the most important things is that grief is a normal, natural reaction to loss. It's normal and natural, but it doesn't feel normal and natural when you're going through it. It feels like there's something wrong with you.
Yes.
And I think often we feel like I'm broken or there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, but we're not. And it's so important to get that message out there that you are not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. You don't need to be fixed. You just need to be heard. Your heart needs to be heard. And I think one of the things I think that's really difficult, and I don't know if you've experienced this, but like when you're at the funeral, when you're, dealing with that grief and there's people around you, people don't always know what to say. And sometimes there's things that are said that are not always helpful. And it makes you feel sometimes even more broken or that you need to be, because we do as a society, we want to take care of each other and nurture each other, which is wonderful.
Right.
But sometimes what happens is we say stuff that is actually more hurtful than helpful.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I remember I didn't experience it as much as my mom did going through, the process. It was, her ex-husband at the time, but then also when my sister died. So my parents had 2 kids, so it was my older sister. And people would tell her like, well, you have another kid. Like, like your world's not over. Like you still have a child, which, and I'm sure looking back, hopefully those people are like, wow, what a crazy thing to say. But yes, absolutely. And I think sometimes too, it's really how we internalize it and how we feel we're being perceived, because even if someone's not saying something hurtful and they're just kind of looking at you unsure what to say, you're like, wow, so now I feel broken, but now nobody else knows how to relate to me and they're looking at me like, I need pity or like I'm a puzzle they need to solve kind of. So yeah, there's definitely like a lot of weirdness and awkward going through it and everyone's feeling it together, but nobody really talks about it. And that's why I think like shows like this and books like this are so important and so vital, because grief is something we're all going to experience at one point or another. And it kind of feels like once you go through it, you're like on the other side. Like there's this group of people who don't understand, and then there's this group of people who have been through it. And we're all going to need to join together because we're all going to go through it at one point, and every loss is different. Right? So like when I lost my dad, I was like sad, devastated, emotional. And then when I lost my sister, I was really angry. She had walked through losing our dad together. And instead of, I think, letting myself feel the sadness when she was in the hospital, I was like, how could you do this to me? Like you watched dad go through this and now like you're making me go through it again, which is, another example of kind of those thoughts and feelings that we feel bad about, especially like in the Christian space. We're like, oh, we can't say that. That's a bad thought. We're not supposed to, feel things like that. But I did not try to shy away from some of those thoughts and feelings in the book. So I'm hoping that also helps people feel, like you're not a bad Christian because you're going through this very real and raw process.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important that because if we're not expressing what we're really feeling, we're not really dealing with it. We're not being authentic. And when my mom died, it was like, I don't understand how to even be happy right now. I'm really struggling with this. I'm sad. And when I felt like I couldn't be sad going to church, or I couldn't be sad in front of other people, you put on a mask, and I'm wearing a mask and I'm not dealing with it. And so I'm pushing it down. And unfortunately, it will explode at some point. And when it does, it is such a big explosion. At least for me, it was such a big explosion that it covered like everybody around me.
I think is so important. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that kind of is, what we were hinting at earlier, where it may not even be an intentional pushing down, but if we're not addressing it and really like giving space to our thoughts and feelings, we're suppressing. Yeah. And that's not good in the long term, like you experience.
Yeah, and absolutely. And one thing that, when you're talking about us feeling like you can't be sad or angry or mad, that's one of the biggest myths, that we're not allowed to be sad or mad at something, but it's just a feeling. It's just an emotion. And it's like we talk about in the grief recovery method a lot about that being one of the big myths. And I did this as a mom. I did this too. So I'm not perfect at all. But when your child comes home and says, I had a really bad day, I had an argument with my friend, whatever. Oh, don't be sad about it. You're going to be okay. Here, have a cookie. Or we substitute it with something else, replace it. But it's also that don't feel bad. We're telling them that that's not right.
Like, get over it. Slap a Band-Aid on it. Get some ice cream. You're good to go.
Absolutely. And what happens is they found out that like by the time a kid is 15 years old, they've heard thousands and thousands of times not to feel bad or sad about anything. So we wonder why our youth, our kids go into their room and deal with their pain in isolation, and they go to other things to make themselves feel better because they're not being allowed to express their feelings. They can express happiness, but when it comes to sadness, feeling bad, whatever, if you can't express it, you go into your room, you deal with it some other way. And that's really sad. We need to make sure that, especially the youth, but also us adults, that we don't just go to a room and hide it. Don't go into the closet and hide it so nobody can see it. We need to be able to find people that are safe, that we can talk to about it. Somebody that doesn't judge, critique you, analyze you, and just lets you be honest with how you're feeling at that moment.
Absolutely. And I think that's even like one of the reasons that kids and young adults that are going through grief, or really going through anything in life, it's easier for them to connect with their friends than family. And it's not even that their family is, meaning anything bad by it, but sometimes they want to fix the problem for us. Mm-hmm. They make us feel better, where our friends are like, oh yeah, vent, let it out, like let's, go through all the things, scream, hate your pillow, whatever. And I even remember, like, sometimes even people we love, when we were in Florida, when my sister was in the hospital, my now husband, he didn't get to meet my dad and he didn't get to meet my sister, but we were dating when she was in the hospital. And my mom and I went to Florida to, be with her and be with family and figure everything out. And he was still home in Arizona. And he would call and just kind of like tell me about his day was going. And I remember getting so mad because you're in this, like, you feel like the whole world is ending and everything's going on. And you're like, how are you telling me about like your lunch right now? Like, how is this, important in this moment? But then it's like when all they do is talk about it, you're like, no, please, like, I just need to talk about something normal, like, let's not talk about it. And so sometimes it's really just us responding, and everything feels like not good enough because there's always, a problem or something weird or how somebody said something. So really being able to find those safe people and knowing on the other side, right? Like, he wasn't mad at me for feeling that way. He was like, no, I understand you're going through a lot right now. Like, we're going to have grace with each other and get through this. But really being able to talk about it, and even if that looks like writing about it, for people too, or singing about it, or, making art about it, wherever you can let out your feelings is a great release.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you have a favorite poem in your book?
Oh, that's hard.
I'm sure you love them all, but
I
Do you have one that you want to share?
Maybe. I do have some here. I know. Okay, the first one is really special to me. It's the very first one that I actually wrote, so that's why I kept it number one. But it also, I think, really played a role in showing my love for literature anyway, because I got to include some references in there that really made it feel authentic. But the very first one is called The Sonnet I Did Not Want, and it reads as follows. I thought you were a ballad, the ballad of my life. Slow, poetic, beautiful, I didn't know you would live a half-life. Shakespeare was wrong, and so was frost. Thy eternal summer did fade, and gold has too high a cost. I wanted the gold, I did, but you didn't grow old, and I want to see your eyes, not your lid. Now I know that I cannot expect a ballad from you. You were meant to be a sonnet, I discovered, but I wrote too many lines, and you never recovered. So that felt very authentic to me because of, my relationship with my dad from, birth all the way up until when he had passed. And then I also just really liked the journey of writing that one, especially because the last two lines, I really did write too many lines, and that's kind of what it felt like there was just too much. And so really being able to just process through that and write it down was very therapeutic.
That's great. Yeah. So in the book, this is it, Echoes of Absence. By Chelsey Gordon. So I just wanted to share that with you. It's great. It has a lot of great poems in it, but then at the end of the book, it does have your story.
Oh yeah, there's two different versions. So the signature edition, I did. I kind of just shared the real truth behind a lot of stuff, which was also really weird because both of my father's parents are still alive, and his brother and family and everything, and so it was kind of hard to write and honor them and protect some of that story and family, and not share too much, but share enough to be truthful and really detail what happened.
Right. Wow. So you have two of these different, you have one that's Echoes of Absence. They're both titled the same.
Yes. So there's the original.
Okay.
And then there's the signature edition. And you can tell it's a little bit thicker, but there's also gold on the cover.
Okay, signature addiction. That's the one I have. I have that
yes,
one.
You have the big one, the one with the story.
Yes. Well, that's great. And anything else that you want to talk about, share?
It's really on my heart to create a space where people can process through their grief alone and together in community, right? Because even with how important community is, like we've been discussing, grief is not something that only we go through, but it is still very much a personal thing. And so really being able to, sit with those thoughts when you're by yourself and also be able to process through them when you're with your safe people, I think is really important. And nowadays, community is hard for us anyway, right? Where, people are glued to their devices, everyone's on social media, everyone's working and hustling and, doing all the things. So I think really being able to just acknowledge that we need a space for this in the world and even in church, right? Like in Christian spaces, we still need to be able to talk about this and really share some of that. So I think what you're doing is amazing. I love intentionally creating spaces for people to discuss instead of just kind of hoping they stumble upon something that helps them process through. I think what you're doing is incredible.
Thank you. Well, one thing that you were talking about is that it's very unique. You were talking about that when the difference between when your dad died and when your sister died and how unique, but it's also any loss is completely unique. Any grief moment is unique. Even when you did have your sister and your dad died, it's the same dad, but you both have a completely different relationship with him. Absolutely. So the grief that you guys are going through is completely unique. Mm-hmm. Your relationship with that person is completely unique. So it's going to be different between the two of you. Some people don't, when a family member dies, sometimes people think that you should be grieving the same way or feeling the same way about that person, but everybody's relationship with that person is completely unique.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's different each time. It's good that you bring that up. That was, kind of another grief that I was going through because my sister was a lot closer with my dad. She was 11 years older than me. So part of the distance was really just a significant age gap. My mom jokes that, she raised two only children because of the gap. But she, was closer with my dad. And so when he died, I kind of was grieving, oh, you knew him, this way. You knew the real him, I felt. And I kind of knew part of him. But then when she died, that also felt like I was going through losing my dad again, not just because of how eerily similar, the situations were with them being in the hospital and overdosing and everything like that, but it also felt like, oh, now all of this knowledge of my dad is gone. Like now all the way you knew him, like all of the intimate memories you have, like I'm not going to be able to hear those now. And, that was also really hard. I have a great relationship with my grandparents. We, love each other. We go back and visit them. Everything is wonderful. But they don't have Jesus. And so they, responded to this grief in a, completely different way as well. And I remember one day so distinctly, they hugged me when we were leaving and they said, "You're all we have left now." Like of my dad, right? Because they didn't have him, they didn't have my sister. And so that, I get, like, I understand what they were saying, but at the time I was internally, not to them, but internally, like, really hurt by that and, like, angry. Like, wow, that feels like a lot of pressure, to put on me. But that's definitely, definitely something I think we feel when we go through the process. I think that the nature of grief can also be different, right? Depending on the circumstance. There was a quote that I saw, I don't even remember how long ago, but it was kind of acknowledging what you were saying. It said, we expect kind of to feel like we're good at grief now, right? Like we lose one person and we're like, okay, we've gone through it. We know what to do. Like surely next time it won't be as difficult, right? Like we've been through this before, but you've never lost a sister before, right? Like you've lost a dad, you've lost a father, but you've never lost a sister before. So this is a totally new grief. This is a totally, new loss to grapple with. But then there's also, kind of the nature of the grief changes. So sometimes we lose somebody very suddenly, which I have not encountered because both my father and my sister were, we got the call, they were in the hospital on life support. Obviously they weren't responsive and they weren't really there when we were with them, but they were still there, in the room. They were still physically there. They were still, breathing even with life support. So we kind of had time to, I don't know, kind of come to terms with it a little bit during those weeks respectively. And I think, that plays a part. And then also when, alcohol and drugs are involved, there's like a little bit of uncertainty because people ask, was it intentional? What was kind of going on here? And sometimes those are just questions that can't really be answered. Like we don't know. Maybe they knew, maybe, and kind of what I talk about in the book as well. Even if we're not intentionally trying, sometimes the way that we live our life and the choices we make and the addictions that, continue in our life kind of lead down that path. So I think a lot of the times when you're a family member of somebody who struggles with addiction, it really does kind of feel like it's not really a matter of if, it's a matter of when, which, can kind of add another dynamic to that loss as well.
Yeah, so there's that anticipatory, you're like expecting someday this might happen, but there's also not just the, we talked a little bit about this, not just the grief of them dying, but it's the grief of everything. There's the grief of their choice in lifestyle and how it affects you.
Right. And there's, even the grief for other people, right? Like, because then, like, I have to watch your parents lose you. Like, I have to watch my grandparents lose their son, which felt, honestly, sometimes even heavier than, like, my loss, right? Like, and not in, like, a, comparing way, but it's really hard to be in hurt and also watching everyone you care about hurting, too. That just feels so, big and intense.
Did you feel like at that time that you had to be strong for them?
I did. I want to say with my dad, not as much, because I was still, pretty young. I was 16 at that time. And everyone around me was older, right? My mom, my sister, my grandparents, my uncle, everyone was kind of older. And I think I felt kind of safe to grieve because I felt like that was expected. Like nobody would, think it was weird or like that I couldn't. But I think with my sister, I definitely felt like I had to be strong because my mom was alone. So we were, in Florida. My stepdad and I have a great relationship. They have a beautiful marriage, but he wasn't with us. And so we were there and it was her daughter. Like that's... Yeah. It's a very different grief from, losing your ex-husband. And I know it was so hard on her. It was right around the time of their anniversary. And she always... she was the one who had to deal with everything with my dad, like be communicating with the doctors, making the decisions about life support, really just keeping everything, together. And she had to do that for my sister too. So I did feel like I wanted to be strong for her during that time because she was kind of being strong for everyone else. But yeah, there's all those those layers that really just build up.
And sometimes, again, for me, I felt when my mom died, I had to be strong for my dad. because it was his wife.
Right.
So I felt like I had to, and I was older. I was in, a young adult. But unfortunately, that's another myth, that we have to be strong for somebody else, because then we deny sometimes dealing with our own grief. And so we put it off. I'm like, I have to just be strong for him. I can't show him that I'm sad. I don't know about you, but for me, I couldn't show my dad that I was sad. I did at the funeral, but after that, I felt like I had to pull it together.
Which, and honestly, like, even though that's a betrayal to us, it's also like kind of a betrayal to the other person, because you're like, you're not being honest with you, like, we're not being honest
Right.
with them, and then they want to see that, we're sad, and that we're going through the emotions, and that they're not alone. So it really is like finding that fine balance, and really, avoiding what you were talking about earlier, where when we do push it down, something's going to come out. Whether it's, angry or crying, is going to be emotional either way. And we don't want to put our own minds and souls through that, but we also don't want to, do that at the expense of the other people that we love who are going through something painful too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I love, so what I do is the grief recovery method. And that's why I love it so much, because we talk about, it's education program, but it also helps us deal with all of that pain that we stuff down. So we're identifying the grief that maybe it was a long time ago that we didn't deal with, like in our childhood, that comes up when something else comes up. We talk about not just grief that comes from the death of a loved one, but grief that comes from loss of a job, loss of health, loss of income, all kinds of things. And especially after COVID, it's a loss of connection to community sometimes. We're so used to doing everything on our screens, like you said earlier, that there's that big loss of community, the one-on-one, that you're actually seeing somebody in person. What we do is we teach tools to help people go through their grieving process, so that they can have, when they do hear those songs that we talked about earlier, when they have that sense of smell where it's Christmas and they smell the pines or the cookies or whatever, that they have those great memories. That's what we're all about. And that's what, we want people to be able to share their hurts and pains, but be able to heal from them and have that hope that after a major loss, you can have hope again. You can have that joy again. You can go past that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, like, I see what you post on social media. I love that you have a presence and you're doing your podcast and everything, because I think a lot of the times when we hear grief, and when we hear, like, grief coaching or grief recovery or grief healing, we really do just think about death. Like, we think about the loss of a loved one. But there's so many, there's little grief that, like, we go through when we're younger, right? Like losing a family pet, or, I don't know, you're young and you try out for that school play and you don't get the part you want. Like, that's a real pain that you have to go through, and you have to learn how to process that and be okay with it, and move on to the next step, but not dishonor what you're feeling in the moment. And I think even when we get older, like, I think if we just think of grief as a death loss, we're really not doing justice to our feelings and our processing. For example, when people get assaulted, right? Sometimes you're grieving, like, the perceived safety you had before, or like
Absolutely.
the way you viewed people before. And if your house catches on fire, you're not just losing your house, you're losing the memories there. You're losing the things you wanted to do, the future that you saw in that house. There's so much that goes into it, and sometimes we just hyper focus on the one, like, big loss, that we really forget about all these little things until they come back up.
Yeah, and you absolutely, you said it. We a lot of times call those intangible losses. The loss of safety, the loss of trust, the loss of hope, the loss of something better, different tomorrow. I do talk a lot, because of my story of my traumatic brain injury and chronic illness that is in my family. That I do talk about that. That loss of man, the life I wish I had, or the life I thought I was going to have. And wishing for that something better, different, more. And sometimes we don't always see those things as a loss.
Right.
We don't realize that we're grieving those things. It's just, it's there, and we stuff it some more. We're always stuffing.
Absolutely, yes. It's humans go through a lot. We're very complicated, but if there's one thing we can count on, we're gonna try to, stuff things up and not talk about them.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, thank you so much. I think we're, coming at time right now, but I just wanted to, really thank you so much for joining us today. And I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your book. It's Echoes of Absence. And where can they get this book?
There is a link on my Instagram, and then there's also an Amazon link for the ebook.
Okay, great. And we will put that in the notes below, and that you can have a link to get Chelsey's book. And if you want to reach out to her, we'll have her Instagram so you can reach out to her. And if you guys want to know anything more about how to deal with grief and loss of any kind, it doesn't have to be death of a loved one. It can be any kind. And sometimes it's a loss of a relationship of somebody that wasn't great in our life. It could be divorce or breakup, and it could be a miserable relationship, but there can be still loss there. Just reach out to me. My link is in my bio. Just reach out to me and at any time. But thank you so much. Is there anything, last words, Chelsey, that you would like to say?
You're not alone. If you're one of those people that Kelli was just talking to, you're not alone. You are loved, you are valued, you are treasured, and there is healing to be found.
Thank you. I couldn't say that any better. Thank you so much.
Thank
it was so
you
great
for
having
having
you.
me.
All right. Bye, everybody.